we'd like to present to you the answers of the candidates that have answered our invitation. We have the Education Chair, Megan Kelly, who will ask a very important question.
Given the most recent pandemic, we were caught a little bit off guard by the need for distance learning. So what would you do to ensure that our teachers receive sustainable training for how to implement distance learning? And the second part of the question is, what would you do to ensure that families all have the appropriate technology in their home, as well as access to Wi-Fi to use that technology for distance learning?
The silver lining of the coronavirus war or crisis is that it's really brought to the fore all of the existing weaknesses, all of the existing inequalities that we have in our system. So that's the silver lining. And one of the areas, of course, where this has been obvious is in the education area. And watching what families have had to do, what teachers have had to do to adjust, and seeing the difference in terms of how communities adjust has, again, only highlighted the fact that there were already inequalities that were not being addressed. The biggest one, of course, is access to computers and the internet. I do think that the federal government needs to do more. You know, we have had funding for for reducing inequality and subsidies for rural areas, but I don't think there's been enough money and thought put into what to do about the underserved in areas that aren't rural, and including homeless children, because I think one of the, again, areas where we haven't thought about how do we equip shelters if they're going to be the places where children are supposed to learn. So that we clearly need to come up with better systems to allow children to be learning wherever they are. We need to, I mean, education is, of course, underfunded across the board, and it's one of the things that I consider a building block for creating kind of a level playing field when you're starting off in society. You know, my parents came here they came here as refugees, they fled communist Hungary, they had nothing, right? But then the society, you know, should have created for all Americans this level playing field. It was never level then, and it certainly isn't level now. And so, but I understand keenly that they got some things, you know, that allowed me to spring into our society and get to the point where I'm now running for Congress. I would like for all of the children in our communities the same opportunity. And so I think coming out of the coronavirus, we recognize that we need to do something to really quickly address inequality, because the longer this goes on, the more it perpetuates the differences in terms of learning based on income. And so that's a really significant, serious problem, obviously, for Black and brown communities, for refugee or immigrant communities. We need to make sure that we don't perpetuate that, and we do something to kind of rush in, because otherwise we're going to see more children and more losses coming out of these generations where kids don't have options because they've missed schooling, they've missed opportunities, and they're not being fostered right now by the teachers and people who would normally be helping them along the way because of the need to be, you know, socially distanced. So, and the lack of access to internet. So that's kind of a long answer to your initial question, or I guess to the question. I mean, I think there's more that needs to be done to help with the educational system, starting with childcare and then early childhood education. We need to fully fund that. We need to fund after-school programs. We need to make sure that teachers are paid. You mentioned the affordable pay of teachers. Teachers must be paid more. It's ridiculous. Again, they are like the front line, just like healthcare workers, you know, frontline soldiers in our society, helping create opportunity for future generations. So teachers should be paid more. We also need to make sure we have nurses. So nurses and therapists, basically, are social workers in every school. So starting from elementary on up. And then I can talk about, you know, more educational things that we need to do in terms of creating opportunities for people who graduate from high school now. Do they have vocational college, all of that?
I'm so grateful for that question, because I've been spending a lot of time thinking about it recently, in particular in the midst of COVID. And maybe unsurprisingly, this is personal for me. I grew up in an underserved school district called the East Ramapo Central School District. My foray into politics was as a freshman at Spring Valley High School, when I saw how difficult it was to pass a public school budget, which is something that other school districts just take for granted. And I reactivated the Spring Valley NAACP Youth Council and helped get out the vote and pass those school budgets. And of course, they are much harder to pass right now in the East Ramapo Central School District than they were before. We desperately need a partner in government, both at the state level and at the federal level, which is where I'm running to be. At the state level, I have been fighting for more foundation aid for our public school districts, which is something that is needed not just in East Ramapo, but in North Rockland and in Peekskill and in Ossining and in Greenburgh and in Port Chester. But we also need a federal government to step in. We have to make sure that education truly is that great equalizer. I grew up in Section 8 housing and on food stamps. So for me, if I hadn't had a quality public education, I wouldn't be able to run for Congress right now. And I know that for too many people, that's just not available to them. We have to make sure that we are increasing funding for under Title I for our most impoverished school districts. We have to make sure that we are fully funding the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act. And there are a number of other titles under our education law that would provide support in terms of technology, like laptops, for example, and also making sure that our administrators are trained in how to use these things. And there's one other piece to it that I wanted to mention, and that is there are a lot of people who don't have internet access in our district, and so we may be able to secure laptops for them, but they can't afford to pay for the internet on a monthly basis, which may come as a surprise to some people. But the fact is that this economy is just not working for everybody. And so I'm fighting for that. I'm fighting to make sure that everyone has that no one has to make a crazy decision about whether or not they're going to be able to pay their rent versus paying the internet bill. And so those are the kinds of things that I'm fighting for. But it's money. It's making sure that our school districts are adequately funded, which they are not. Peekskill is one of those school districts that is underfunded at the state level and at the federal level.
Oh, excellent question. By the way, I am an educator. I've been a professor in Baruch College, so I understand the disadvantages that teachers go through. And I must tell you, on a federal level, I would definitely support that we need to have more training in communities, especially in the education system and community centers, to ensure that we have some training when it comes to technology. In fact, when I first joined the race, I have been a true advocate of making sure we support STEM programs in community centers, building up hubs for young people, as well as for the older generation to learn about science, technology, mathematics, and engineering, and expand on that, because that's what helps us with not only for the 21st century job market, but also to get through a crisis as we're learning right now. So that is definitely one thing I would support, is ensuring that we have strong STEM programs in community centers as well as in the education system, so we can be able to acquire strong skill sets when it comes to technology. It's all about redirecting the funding from the federal level to your actual community. So as your elected official, as a congressional member, I would ensure that we have federal funding to support local programs in the area, like the youth borough, to ensure that they have more federal funding at the youth borough in Peekskill, that they start supporting STEM programs there.
It's an interesting question. Let me say that it's funny that I haven't thought about the connection from an education standpoint. I have been concerned, and what I mean by that is I've been concerned for a long time that Wi-Fi and cable access to information is so expensive, right? We have these monopolistic systems where basically you have one, maybe two providers in an area, and you spend what? More than $100, sometimes almost $200 a month to get the full complement of TV and internet. And it starts, sometimes they get you in with those teaser rates, and then 2 years later you're back up again, and it's insane. And so one thing I would support is federal grant money and working with our state and local partners to ensure that information equality exists. So in other words, that every community has Wi-Fi, so that every community can access the internet on phones and on computers, because access to information is a fundamental aspect to equality and education at this point. So I think that's a great point. I haven't really thought about that connection until you made it about the coronavirus. where we need access to bandwidth at homes. And I think actually that's a great point. And so the other thing we need to do is we need to make sure that every school district and system is prepared. For example, for the first few weeks in New York City, they had Zoom learning. And then it turned out that the DOE said, no, we don't want to do Zoom. We want to do this Microsoft thing. And it sent parents into a justified panic because there was so much uncertainty about what are the systems we're going to use. So I think what I would support is ensuring that we have enough federal funding of our school districts so that everybody has a minimum floor, whatever the district they live in and whatever their community tax rates are, so that everybody can get a quality education in the 21st century at public school. I graduated from, first I went to PS6 in Manhattan, and I was lucky to be in a magnet program there, and I went to public school. I don't know, anybody else on this call go to one of the PSs in the city ever at any point? There you go, we got at least two. So I went to PS6, and then we moved to Westchester, and I was very lucky to go to public school the whole way through. There's nothing better than a good public school education. So my view is we need federal support to ensure everybody's public education is acceptable. In your neck of the woods, there's a little bit of a challenge. I don't know about quite in Peekskill, but certainly in nearby towns, Buchanan and Verplank and everything, with the closure of Indian Point and what that's going to do to the tax revenue that supports schools. So my view is we do need more federal educational support. And I think part of that should be to require, kind of like how we have fire drills, a protocol, so that we say, if there is a pandemic, are we ready? And can we educate our students?
Okay.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, one of the big concerns, I've been working with our superintendents and our teachers since this pandemic just reared its ugly head. So there's a multitude of things. I think first, we have to make sure that the funding is there. And that's why I'm pushing and advocating to make sure that the federal government provides funding to the states, localities, including school districts, so we can have the funds that we need to meet this endeavor that we know is so important. So in that, we have to make sure that we're providing the tools, the training on how to use the software or the hardware, and making sure that we have a 1-to-1 ratio at least. What I'd like to see is that you have a tablet or whatever the technology may be, but you have at least one that's in the school and one for the child to bring home. And I think that is a reality of our time. And I think what COVID-19 is doing is making us embrace it sooner. That the reality is that the jobs of the future, we have to make sure that our children and all of us really know how to use this technology. And we know that the digital divide is real. We know that there's some parts of our community that can afford the iPads and the desktops and the laptops, and there's others that can't. And the reality is that every child should have access to that. So it starts with the funding, but also we have to make sure that there's the technology there. One of the things that I've been talking to on the state level, at least, is that it actually becomes a line in our funding formula where you have the technology piece. So the idea of making sure, just like we have healthcare services for our children, we have a funding line. Every child in New York State is guaranteed at least $39.75 for a textbook. We have to make sure that we have that same type of funding structure for technology, like a laptop or a tablet. So that's one piece that I think is very important. One thing that I'm working on right now is the 180-day requirement for our schools to be open. The governor did an executive order saying that schools can be closed, but they have to use all their vacation days before they'll be able to get that funding. So that's something that we're trying to get clarity on, and we're hopeful that we'll actually be able to pass legislation this week in the Senate, because we're going up to the Senate. But also another part on the federal level, obviously, because that's why I'm here tonight. The Education for Children with Disabilities Act that was passed over 40 years ago is supposed to be a funding mechanism for the federal government to our schools to allow them to provide proper education to children with disabilities. That has never been anywhere close to fully funded. And that's one of the top priorities that I have, because I believe that's a mechanism in place that if we bring the funding level up, that will help all of our school districts and allow them to do the things that we know are so necessary in this day and age.